All right, guys. How's everyone doing today? Hope everyone's surviving. It's 100 degrees here and quite hot, and my AC is failing me, so it's significantly hotter than I would like it to be. But today we're going to be talking about the Valensole case. This case has been called Europe's #1 close encounter and one of Europe's best UFO cases by some of their top ufologists. It was Jacques Vallée's, I guess, most interesting case, one of his best cases. And Valensole, so I'll just tell you a little bit about Valensole. Valensole is a small town in the French Basis Alps that's kind of particularly well known for its lavender fields, to the point that the Chinese travel there in large numbers when it's during the time of the year that they're growing, in order to take photographs, do things like weddings. And in fact, the scenery is used for a popular Chinese television show. Now, this small commune of Valensole in the Alpes de Haute-Provence is roughly about 3,000 inhabitants that live in it. And it's also known for a much older event, the encounter of a 41-year-old farmer named Maurice Masse. And I also just want to give my usual disclaimer for butchering and mispronouncing various place people names and whatnot. I don't actually speak French, so I apologize in advance for that. And Maurice Masse had this kind of plot of land on this lavender plateau in Valensole, and this is basically where this encounter had happened. And this event takes place during, so it starts off during the last week of June 1965. Maurice Masse and his father had noticed someone that had been picking the shoots from the lavender plants out on their farm, on their little farm or plot of land that's called the Olival. Okay, yeah, sorry, gonna butcher the names. And this plot of land is located roughly 2 kilometers northwest of Valensole. The damage done to their lavender is minor, but he hopes to be able to catch them and kind of put a stop to it. And about a week, it's been going on for about a week. And then on the early morning of July 1st, Masse is with his tractor on a field, and he's getting ready to start his day. And he decides to take a smoke break near a tall pile of rubble and debris. It's about 5:45 in the morning, and while he's smoking a cigarette, he's suddenly startled by this loud whistling kind of sound. He decides to step out from behind the pile to get a better look at what is causing the noise. At first, he thinks it's probably a helicopter that has landed in his field, and he would tell people that helicopters have landed in or around his field in the past, and he always makes an effort to go talk to the pilots. He's a hunter, and a lot of these pilots, I guess, like to hunt and fish, and he makes an effort to go talk to them when they land. But instead of a helicopter, he is greeted with an elliptical, or what he refers to as a rugby ball-shaped object that has a semi-transparent cupola on top. The object is resting on 4 to 6 legs. He reports 6 legs in pretty much all the initial reports. But you can only see kind of 4 legs in the drawing there. But 4 to 6 legs, roughly 90 meters away from Masse, in a spot in his lavender field that's just south of a vineyard. And again, like I say, you see 4 legs there. All his initial reports to like the gendarmes and in the media basically say 6 legs. But he would tell ufologist Jacques Vallée that it was only 4 legs. He says this object is roughly the size of a Renault Dauphine automobile, and it has a center pivot, a steel-colored center pivot that is lodged into the ground. And these are these Renault Dauphine automobiles. I guess they're quite popular car in France at the time. And that give you an idea of the kind of size, I guess, or perspective of these things. Now, squatting down on the ground near this device were these 2 figures dressed in these suits that appear to be examining his lavender plants. He would compare the size and shape of these creatures to an 8-year-old child. But as soon as he saw them, he knew this was no ordinary encounter. Masse, aware of the uniqueness of the situation, but a brave and courageous individual. He was a resistance fighter in World War II. and apparently was unafraid, but still cautiously, as to come up upon them with surprise, cuts through this vineyard in order to get a closer look at these creatures. And he would recall 6 weeks later in his August 18th testimony or interview to the gendarmerie, quote, "I got within a point 7 meters from the machine by skirting around the vineyard that adjoins my field and then making for the machine, which I could see from an angle. From the moment that I had started out from the heap of stones, I knew that it wasn't with men that I had to deal. And I watched them the whole time I was moving across through the vineyard. Both these beings were down on the ground. They were squatting down. One had his back to me, and the other one was opposite of him. And it seemed to me that they were looking at a lavender plant. When I had got to the distance of 7 meters with them, the one who was facing in my direction then saw me." Now, from his new vantage point of only about 15 to 20 feet away, about 7 meters or so, he was able to get a better look at these small men that were standing basically in front of him. And he reports that they're roughly about 1.2 meters in height, and they were covered in these kind of gray-green coveralls. And I will report that in a lot of the initial reports in some of the press reported the coveralls were an orange or like a yellowish color, but most of the reporting refers to them just as like a dark color or a dark suit color. And the color of this craft was supposedly like a little darker than the suit color was. But eventually he would say that they were these gray-green color coverall suits. And he reports that they have these large, smooth, bald, pumpkin-like heads. And their skin is kind of it's a pale skin. I say, quotes, "Their complexion didn't strike me. It was close to that of a white man." Elsewhere, he said it basically looked like a European man. Their hands were bare, but they appeared basically human. They didn't have any facial hair either, in addition to being bald. Where they had these large kind of slanted eyes that I guess sort of wrapped around, towards the side a slight bit. But where the mouth was supposed to be, all there was this kind of like a hole. And these illustrations the problem with illustrations is they don't necessarily represent things exactly accurate. The illustration on the left kind of has a slit for a mouth, but there is basically like a hole. There is no lips. And each of these beings also carried on the one right side a small case, on the left side supported by a belt, a larger case. And these beings appeared to communicate with each other through this kind of like a grunting or say a gurgling kind of like sound that did not appear to emanate from the mouth, because, as I mentioned, the lips did not move as you would expect when somebody is speaking. And it was more like it was like a guttural kind of like a sound generating from within. Now, one of the and Masse says, quote, "He must have made a sign to the other, I suppose. Both of them stood up, and the one that had turned to face me had made a gesture with his right arm and hand in which I distinguished an object. At that moment, I was immobilized, so I could do no movements. I did not feel anything. I wasn't numb or contracted. I just couldn't make any gestures or move my head, arms, legs, or bodies." So the being that pointed this tube-like immobilizer device at him would place it back in his case on the right side. On the other side was what Masse thought was a larger, what he referred to as a weapon. And he'd say that, he quote, "If they had used the big one, I wonder what would have happened. With that, they can stop an army." Elsewhere, he basically said they could have leveled the whole Valensole plateau with the larger weapon that they had. Instead, they used a smaller weapon on him that is almost kind of like you would imagine the Men in Black neuralizer. It just kind of freezes him in place, but it's not like a muscular contraction, because he still has full control of like his involuntary movements, like his heart's still pumping, he's still breathing, but he's just kind of frozen in place. It's almost like when you go into a sleep state. When you're asleep, you still breathe, your heart still goes, but your body shuts off, your conscious movement and function. So you're not like kicking around and moving around in your sleep. So it was kind of like that. So he was immobilized by this object, and he hints that these beings, may have also had a telepathic communication with him, but he refuses to talk about what happens really after he becomes immobilized. Relentless efforts by investigators over the years to try and discover his secrets would fail. But he would insist that the entities were kind and meant us no harm. And despite their larger skull, which in some places are referred as 2 to 3 times kind of larger than normal, their faces were typically human, not just humanoid, they were human. Mikhail would suggest that the differences, such as the larger heads and whatnot, were an adaptation for the environment they are from. But it's the typical human form, which would suggest a human genetic code. He even goes on to suggest a potential hybrid breeding program based on selected, utility and function that these alien beings or whatever would need based on the environment and situation. So, and Masse, he would say to Amy Mikhail, they are good. They have only good intentions for us. Of that I am sure. And Mikhail would respond back to him, but how do you know that? And he says, I can tell you, I don't know how I know, but I am sure of it. So he was positive. He couldn't explain why, but he was positive of the good nature of these beings. Now, these 2 small beings, after he becomes immobilized, and there's a little bit of dispute here. One of his reports to the gendarmerie say that it was 4 to 5 minutes after he was immobilized that these beings then took off. And during this time, they were seemingly communicating with each other. But the vast majority of the reports say that immediately after he's immobilized, they quickly enter the craft to kind of take off. And they enter this craft with, what they say is surprising agility. And I was a little bit confused by that, as were others. But what I take it to mean is that the doorway of this craft was not much larger than their frame. It was only slightly taller than they are and only slightly wider than they are. So they kind of had to kind of go into it, not that easily. But they moved through the doorway nimbly, placing the right hand on the door first, and then climbing in and with the left hand. And then this door basically slides up from the bottom to the top. So it's one of these sliding doors again. And with a dull noise, a whistling sound, the pivot that was stuck into the ground retracts back into the hole, disappearing, and the metal legs start to rotate clockwise, almost like a helicopter that was upside down. Those legs apparently start to rotate around. But while it's doing this, there's no dust, or smoke that's raised by the device's movement. And while it's raising up off the ground, Masse observes the 2 beings are watching him through that transparent cupola that's on the top of the craft. While he's watching these beings, the object begins to move away on an oblique trajectory. So it's moving away in an opposite direction. So if you're imagining the occupants are facing you and looking at you, it starts to move basically like backwards away as they're looking at you in the opposite direction. And it's doing this at immense speed west towards the town of Manosk. And this object remained visible for only about 20 meters in the air before it suddenly just disappeared or vanished in a immense great deal of speed. And Amy Mikhail would ask him and try and clarify, like, what he means by vanish, like, does it, like, disappear, or does it just get so fast that he couldn't follow it anymore? And he had a little difficulty explaining, but he just said it was gone. It disappeared. It was there, and then it wasn't there anymore. And he scanned the sky, and he could not see it. But despite not being able to see it after about 20 meters, they did discover these traces in the ground of going for about 100 meters in the direction that the craft took off from. He's still unable to move for about 15 minutes, and when he's then finally able to slowly recover the use of his limbs. 3 days after the event, he would suffer from bouts of extreme lethargy. He would basically require 12 to 15 hours of sleep a day instead of the usual 4 to 5 hours that he typically required. And this would go on for several weeks before his sleep patterns would return to normal. And after regaining control of his body, he went to investigate the spot this object had rested on. Now, at the landing site, he finds that the ground is soaked, but it will later become extremely hard, like cement, when it dries. And he finds a slight depression that's roughly 1.2 meters in diameter in the shape of a bowl. And within the center, a cylindrical hole about 18 centimeters in diameter and 40 centimeters deep that ends in these three small holes that could suggest that some sort of device was opening up from the base of the pivot. And finally, he discovers these four furrows forming a cross extending from the center hole. And these cross basically represent where these landing legs were, the 4 points. And he would return later that evening at about 8:30 p.m. with his 18-year-old daughter and discovered that that liquid mud that he discovered in the morning had now hardened like cement. And now that center hole had become kind of the shape of a reverse funnel or a sump pump, if you know what that looks like. If you look at that image of the ground traces with those three kind of legs, you can kind of imagine it looks like that. And now there's a little bit of uncertainty as to what he does after he regains full mobility beyond checking that landing site. In a later interview with the gendarmeries, he states that, quote, "I remained immobilized for quite a long time after the depression of the machine. I estimate about 15 minutes, obviously daring against my will, and I was afraid of remaining so long without being able to move. Then I was able to move my hands, and almost immediately the whole body and my limbs as before. I then left for my tractor, lit a cigarette, and continued my work until 7:30 or 8 o'clock, mounted on my machine. I hoed my vineyard a little, which is not the one I mentioned above. Then I returned home around 8:30 or 9 a.m. roughly." And, he says he has a watch, but he's not in the habit of looking at it. So he's not 100% sure on the time. Right. And so in that version of the story, he continues working for, at least a few hours or a couple hours before he, I guess, returns home. However, this is not the version that is usually reported. And in most versions of the story, he did not return to work. Or he tried to return to work, but his heart was not in it. Instead, he immediately went to town to visit a friend of his, the proprietor of the Café des Sports. And he would report to in one of his first reports with the gendarmes on July 2nd, that it was about 10:30 when he got to his friend's house. So if you recall, this event happened at about 5:45 a.m. If you figure, it was maybe 15 minutes till they took off, maybe 15 minutes after that till he was non-paralyzed, maybe 6:15. Where'd the 4 hours go? So there's almost an element of unexplained or missing time here that hasn't been accounted for, depending on the versions of the stories. But there does, regardless of what version, it seems to be several hours before when this happens to when he actually ends up going to tell his friend the story. And so he gets to this Café des Sports and he tells his buddy this story, who's the proprietor of this cafe. And he tells him, Masse, that he should report it to the police. But Masse doesn't really want any attention, and he doesn't want to be called crazy or to be locked away, or told he's insane, and doesn't want to go out of his way. But his friend of his doesn't really want to leave it there. He ends up going out and checking the landing site and confirming that there are these marks there, and starts to spread the story around the village, and it gets around pretty quickly, and people start to really come to the site and investigate it. And he starts to get large amounts of visitors, and they start to the marks end up getting kind of trampled down a bit. And the story would eventually become to the attention of the local gendarmerie in Valensole commander on the evening of July 2nd. Now, Masse would be interviewed by that local Valensole brigade commander in the evening at about 8 p.m. They would be joined by a company commander and a research brigade commander, I believe from Digny, which is the largest closest town, at about 10 p.m., who conducted a further investigation of the ground and took photos of the site. These photos, they were actually taken on the morning of the 3rd. It was already 11 something at night on the 2nd. And so on the morning of the 3rd, they came back to continue their investigation and take these photos. And on the evening of the 2nd, they investigated or they interviewed Masse. And these are some of the photos they took where you can see these kind of, I guess, these furrows and this landing center impression mark that the thing's left. But that was basically all that was there. They could see that a lot of the other landing marks, I guess, were overrun by the people that kind of visited the site. And the gendarmes themselves noticed the presence of this ground depression, but also, like I said, that the other traces have been erased by visitors. But they're convinced of the kind of good faith and credibility of the witness. He's a respected man around town. Not only does he own this lavender field and farm, he actually owns the local lavender distillery. The lavender is grown and distilled for the perfume industry, and he was a partner with, I believe, two other farmers in the region that owned this distillery that processed the lavender. So he's a respected member of this small town community, and so they took his statement as truthful and in good faith. But for several years, the lavender would have trouble growing at the site. Masse would plow the ground and try to replant the lavender, but the new plants would not take, and they would die and wilt away, shortly after. And the area would become overgrown with like weeds and grass, and you can see that in this picture here, which I believe this one was taken 2 years later. And you can still see these grass and weeds growing in the area there. And in fact, that imprint would continue to be visible to investigators visiting the site for years. These photos were taken in 1969 by a French physicist who went there to investigate the case. And you could still see the grass and weeds kind of overgrown and running in the field with this craft, kind of allegedly landed. And it would take about 8 to 10 years, actually, before the lavender would kind of return and start to grow like normal. Now, the press became immediately involved in this story, and a guy, Victor Nathan, who was a journalist with Le Provençal, accompanied the gendarmes on their investigation to the site on the 2nd. He would snag the first interview with Masse and published a story, and this is a translated English title, obviously. Did a flying saucer land in the Low Alps on July 3rd? Now, several other articles would be published over the following days in the regional and French press. The newspaper La Dauphine Libya published an article, A Flying Saucer in the Basis Alps. And these initial 2 articles were what the first article in, I believe, Flying Saucer Review that kind of broke the story to the English. Well, that's not actually true. The first story, I guess, the kind of English UFO literature, the first story in Flying Saucer Review on this was based on these kind of 2 initial newsprint reports. And he would follow it up again with another story the following day on July 4th. The mystery remains, hold on the Valensole flying saucer. Now, not everyone was convinced of the kind of phenomenal nature of this event. And in the Paris paper Le Monde on July 4th, they would publish an article that says the flying saucer was certainly a helicopter. So they were basically convinced that there were several helicopters in the area taking part in this operation, and they certainly would have been flying over on and near Valensole. And we'll get to that kind of operation in a minute, but they start to mention it in the papers almost immediately. But there is a lot of pushback as well. And again, in La Provençale on July 5th, they push back and say saucer, unknown craft, but not a helicopter. And Masse would basically, a lot of people, understandably would ask, how could he confuse a helicopter at only such a short distance? But the suggestion that it was what was one of these Alouette helicopters, and he couldn't tell it, seemed ridiculous. He would tell people that he counted 6 legs on it, but there was no rotor, no blade. So it wasn't a helicopter. So it was very clear that it could not be a helicopter, despite, the press publishing that was the most rational explanation at the time. And another paper would publish an article, the Saucer Valensole, Le Meridional, talking about his unusual experience. He was pestered by reporters, many reporters apparently, for several days, quite a few days, that he ended up apparently having a nervous wreck or a nervous kind of breakdown, or at least that's what was reported in a follow-up paper. And he basically got out of town, and went, somewhere else for a while to visit, I guess his daughter. They were on vacation in Guines or something. But he got out of town to get away from the reporters. The reporters still kind of followed him and still, got in touch with him while he was on vacation, to try and get statements from him. But it wasn't, it wasn't only the French press that got involved in this. Pretty much immediately, through the various wire services, the U.S. press got involved in the stories. In fact, as soon as July 3rd, the same day the first story published in the French media, it was published in a Lancaster, I believe it's Pennsylvania, newspaper, saying flying saucers left tracks on a farm, Frenchman says. And it would be published in the Sunday Post. I want to say it's the London Sunday Post on July 4th. And the Washington Post would pick it up for a much larger story on July 5th called Frenchman Sees a Flying Object. And it would be included in many other papers throughout the United States, even just small blips about a Frenchman, encountering small beings on his farm in France. So it got a lot of attention and coverage pretty immediately. You could see how somebody could become overwhelmed and want to get out of town for a while. Now, on August 8th, one of France's leading ufologists would show up on scene to investigate the site. And this is, been mentioned him already, Amy McKeel. And he, and the site would also be investigated by a UFO group, GEPA. And they were one of the also first people to publish a report on this story. A local anonymous magistrate for GPA did the investigation, and that was also published in Flying Saucer Review. But on August 8th, Amy McKell shows up to kind of do his own investigation, and he finds that the traces of lavender are visible for a good 100 meters along the direction of the takeoff of the craft. So he found those, those marks that were left after the craft took off. And as far as even, I guess, this little kind of shanty or abandoned house towards Manosque and even beyond. And he says, quote, these traces are degeneration of the young shoots prior to July 1st, which are going dry and falling off, and a singular vitality of the shoots after July 1st. And McHale would return to the site, return to Valensole several more times for a follow-up investigation. In fact, 2 years later, on August 21st of 1967, McHale would come with Flying Saucer Review editor Charles Bowen. They would drive to Valensole to interview Masse and to investigate the site. On this encounter, they would find Masse was calm and serene compared to the visible distress that McHale found him in 2 years earlier. The results of these investigations that both McHale and Bowen and others would be published in Flying Saucer Review over the late 1960s, pretty much starting in fall of 1965. And the last article was published in 1969. Now, one of the things that McHale did in August 1965 when he was there, after he felt that he got all the information out of Masse, because he didn't want to contaminate Masse's story with his own UFO information. So after he felt he got all he could out of him, he decided to show Masse a photo of what was a model of the Socorro, New Mexico craft. And now when Masse saw this photo, which, it wasn't a photo, it was like a model, basically. He was shocked. McHale reported that it looked like death kind of washed over him, that this was his craft. He was so surprised, and he would tell McHale, like, where'd you get this? Somebody took a picture of my craft. How'd they get this picture of my craft? And McHale would say, no, this is a model of a craft that a police officer saw in Socorro, New Mexico the year before. And it was so similar to him that he said You see that I wasn't dreaming and that I'm not mad. And there are plenty of other crafts that kind of match of a similar description. This is a case in Lucca, Italy, from July 25th in 1952, of a craft that's also kind of on these legs. It almost looks like there's a different, separate kind of platform there, but there's a kind of a ladder going in. It's not exact. But if you look at some of these Socorro, New Mexico kind of illustrations and the artwork, and again, illustrations not exactly like the case in these Socorro illustrations. Apparently, this first illustration is a bit more accurate. It was seen really only on these kind of like two legs like that. These four legs on the ground and on that side is artistic liberty. But if you were to see a Socorro, New Mexico sauce illustration like that and a Valensole one, you could quite easily think that they were of the same siding. In fact, many of the illustrations for Socorro almost look like they were taken, like it was like they're in a lavender field. So he was, but basically, so he's shown the Socorro, and it was confirmed to him that people are seeing the same thing as him and that it was real. It was not his craft that they took a photo of, but it was identical in his mind, anyways. Now, obviously, the most down-to-earth explanation is that Maurice Masse saw a military helicopter that has landed on his field, perhaps one of the Alouette 2 or Alouette 3 type. In fact, Masse did first report that he thought it was a helicopter landing in his field, and that it is, something that they have done in the past, and that he had a habit of talking to the pilots when they had made those stops. And as I briefly mentioned before in that newspaper article, it is in fact known that there was a military operation going on at the time called Provence 65 that had been taking place in the area since June 30th. And this again was published within the papers at the time. And these helicopters were taking off from this base kind of area in the plateau of Albion nearby. And this operation, basically, they were doing maneuvers and practice drills, and I guess one of them perhaps was this drill that of like a potential nuclear attack or disaster. And at this time, or the year before, the Valensole Plateau was actually being considered, along with the Plateau of Albion, as being the location of a nuclear, missile site. They wanted to put a bunch of nukes there. They eventually chose Albion, but Valensole was up for consideration along with Albion in order for that future nuclear project. But we do know at this time that this Provence 65 operation was taking place, and it was published in the newspapers. And these are basically the type of helicopters that they suggest, the Alouette 2 and the Alouette 3. And you can see that particularly like this one on the left, while it only impacts the ground in one point, there's two struts. So you could almost mistake that as two legs, but only getting one ground imprint from that. You don't get the same kind of ground imprint you would with the ones that kind of have these track kind of legs. But if you also look at the kind of pilot uniforms, you can see the descriptions are kind of fairly similar. You've got a covered, they're wearing these coveralls. The helmets they're wearing makes their heads look bigger, and like they have got large wraparound eyes. And the size of a normal soldier kind of squatting down might be about 1.2 millimeters. And this paper shows basically flashlights that these kind of guys might be carrying that do look like these tube-like devices that you might see. This is from a paper by an Eric Malot, where he discusses the psycho kind of traumatic effects of kind of a psychotrauma theory for this case, where he did have this experience, but the details perhaps kind of got distorted. And he describes, I just kind of want to read here, a psychotraumatic event is a phenomenon of an invasion of the psyche and an overflowing of its defenses by violent excitations associated with the occurrence of an event that is aggressive or threatening to the life or integrity, either physical or just psychically, of an individual who is exposed to it as a victim or as a witness or as an actor. And he says it's usually things like disasters, accidents, assaults, attacks, and events are likely to generate these psychotraumatic disorders. And when you're suffering from one of these kind of episodes of depersonalization or derealization, you suffer from effects that match quite well with producing experiences like this. It says derealization may be associated with this experience as the feeling that the external world is strange or unreal. The subject may perceive disturbing changes in the size or the shapes of objects, known as macropesia or micropesia. People may seem strange, sometimes even robotic appearing. Other frequently associated features include anxiety symptoms, depressive symptoms, obsessive rumination, somatic preoccupations, and altered perceptions of time. These associated disorders are characterized by a partial or complete loss of the normal functions of integration of memories, consciousness, identity, or immediate sensations, loss of control of bodily movement. Dissociative stupor characteristics characterizes victims in a dazed and stupefied state. So his theory is essentially, this guy could have had an encounter with these helicopters, perhaps due to kind of a post-traumatic stress event, perhaps from his experience as a resistance fighter during the war, and this encounter with these military helicopters, or and these men in military garb, basically was a traumatic incident to him. And those effects do, you can see they match in a way. You do get kind of like a body paralysis. You kind of get frozen, and you've seen that, in people that just get terrified for something. It's like they're not physically paralyzed. It's just they can't move. They're kind of just like stuck there. And he suggests that that's kind of what happened in this case here. I want to see if I can bring up a video here so you can see one of these things. And I want you to pay attention at the end of the kind of the sound these things make. You're asking as it's coming down. That. So when these helicopters both shut down and take off, you get a loud, high-pitched kind of whine or whistling kind of sound that is basically what was reported by Masse when he was startled by that sound and wanted to see what was going on. And that sound, he did believe it was a helicopter at first, possibly partially because of that sound he heard. And so it's one thing to take into consideration. But you also have to, again, ask how he would be confused by seeing a helicopter. And he was quite certain that it did not contain a rotor or any of these other aspects that a helicopter typically had. And how was he paralyzed? If these beings pointed something at him, how was he paralyzed? Again, we have an answer, a psychological answer. And Amy McHale would comment as well that, quote, the police who made the first investigation state categorically that the shape of the marks on the ground show that they were made by no known type of machine, which is contrary to the explanations of the military authorities who have not even examined the marks. So helicopter, not a helicopter. That's the rational explanation that was given at the time. So the rational explanation that is still given. Now, later, Jacques Vallée, a French-American ufologist, would meet with Masse in May 1979. And he met with Vallée. He confirmed that this object actually only rested on 4 legs, not 6, which again contradicts all the kind of earlier reports in which it was reported as 6 legs. In fact, reports in the media, and he would tell people it looked like a monstrous spider. Although spiders do have have 8 legs, not 6 legs. So Vallée met with him, And he would also go on to tell him that he had witnessed these craft on other occasions as well. And this is something that he would share with Amy and McHale when they were there in 1967, that he would have these other sightings or encounters in the area. He shared one of these stories in which he was kind of laying in bed, sleeping one night, and he was woken up as if kind of almost told by a voice, he got this feeling that they were back and that he should go look at the sky and, see if he could see this object again. And when he gets there, he sees a light traveling past. Now, this event took place the exact time and location of a Russian Cosmos rocket reentry event that was seen by many people in the area, and that unfortunately was likely what he saw. But there's, reason to believe that he had several more, at least sightings, and was told of other sightings by people in the area over the years. And he would deny to Vallet that this kind of experience had any sort of religious implications for him, but it clearly did affect him on a deep level. Vallet, like many of the investigators before him, would try and get his secrets out of him, try and figure out more what happened after he became immobilized before the beams took off, see if there was this message that was kind of given to him. But like the investigators before him, Vallet would leave with the feeling that it was, quote, clear Masse had never told the entire truth about his experience. And I just want to show you guys a clip real quick here of Vallet briefly talking about this on a talk show.
Because this goes on all over the world, right? All different governments have
absolutely
the same stuff going on, right?
I've had a chance to study cases, of course, in France, all over Europe, and in South America, and of course in the U.S.
What's the weirdest case you've ever studied?
I'm not sure weird is the right term for it. The most stimulating from a scientific point of view is a case in France in which a farmer was starting his tractor at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he saw something in his field some distance away, and he thought it was a helicopter or maybe a strange car that shouldn't have been there in his field. Mm-hmm. So he walked over, and all of a sudden he was paralyzed. He saw two small creatures. They were not quite the ones that you have here. They were very small, but they had normal heads, and they had normal human features, but he was paralyzed. And they started speaking to each other in some strange language, went back into the object took off. The interesting thing is that there were traces left. Those traces were studied by various agencies of the French government. There was no question he was not lying. The traces could not be duplicated. And he was paralyzed for 20 minutes after the object left, which is very interesting from the point of view of the effect of the kind of radiation that object may have been creating. And this is a very common report on the part of witnesses of this feeling of paralysis.
So this case obviously had a great impact on Vallet, and he considers it, one of the most stimulating cases he has ever worked on. He would publish it, talk about it first briefly in his book Dimensions, and he would discuss it more deeply in his chapter on botanical data in his book Confrontations, A Search for Alien Contact. However, he would do a candid interview with that French physicist that I mentioned, visited him, he would do a candid interview. When that French physicist visited, he tried to talk to Masse, but in fact, he met Masse. Masse basically lied and said he wasn't Masse, that, oh, yeah, I look like him, but I'm not him. And basically, he wasn't able to get an interview with Masse. But he was able to get an interview when he tried to show up again that next day to try and, again, catch an interview with Masse. Unsuccessful. Met Masse's wife and talked to her. And she would relate to him that it was actually a very spiritual experience for Masse. He was permanently changed by the experience, and it would kind of end up following him for the rest of his life. She said, quote, Masse had a feeling of religious respect for the beings from space. He regarded the landing site as having now become their property, as a sacred place where he, Masse, was merely the manager. In fact, she says that he stopped watering the ground, which may have something to do with the plants not growing. But so he stopped watering the ground because he felt that it wasn't his place to mess with the ground, that this land was the property of these beings that landed there. But there's a little bit of a problem with this, though, because if it was such a sacred place that he ordered people not to touch or mess around with, and he supposedly told his family not to sell the land and to never mess with the land, even after he died, then why did he talk about wanting to dig it all up, right after it happened? And in fact, his wife did say he buried the hole back in. And he did replow and reglow the area several times. So that kind of contradicts this story that he considered it kind of like sacred holy land that he wouldn't touch anymore, and he didn't want anyone else to touch. But that is what his wife reported. But he reported to Valais directly that it was not a spiritual case for him. But whatever happened, it had a deep impact on him for the rest of his life anyway. Now, this case was also later investigated. The French UFO group Jepan wasn't around at the time. They didn't establish themselves until May 1977, and Japan basically says the Group on Unidentified Aerospace Phenomenon, and they looked at this case and ended up classifying it as what's called a D-type phenomenon, which means it was not identifiable by experts who had basically comprehensive, accurate reports and were still unable to come to a final conclusion. I imagine it's somewhat similar to kind of like how Hynek would describe a UFO. And so they leave this case as a Class D or D-type phenomenon case. But 20 later, a group of former HEDN members, and HEDN was the Institute for Higher Studies of National Defense, would produce a famous French report called the Cometa Report, which Leslie Kean is actually kind of famous for publishing in English and writing stories about, and it kind of what brought her into the UFO phenomenon, supposedly. And the Cometa Report included the Valensole case in its featured prominently in its report that it put out in 1999. And it basically even went so far as to saying that the witness who was shot with this tube or paralyzing device explained it away as a pulsed microwave effect, similar to being used today by other anti-personnel microwave weapons. And so they kind of reach, I think, a little bit with that. They concluded that the witness, kind of like the gendarmerie did, that he didn't exhibit any of these kind of behaviors that would suspect mythomania, or that he was kind of hoaxing this situation. And it's one of the very few cases that they consider unexplained, despite what they consider the richness of the data available. And this story would continue to be published kind of in popular media and culture. Throughout this presentation, I have used slides from a French comic by Guigui and Loeb that I had translated the text into English. But it was also featured in an American comic series called UFOs and Flying Saucers that was published by Gold Key Western in the late 70s. And they take a bit more liberty with the way they illustrate and visualize this case than the French comics that I used earlier did. But it's still cool to look at all these different places illustrate this. And I actually own this comic right there in excellent shape. And this story would kind of be taken up by this guy, would kind of become its advocate, Maurice Masse. And he was Masse's neighbor. And Masse was, again, he didn't like to talk to people about this story. He really wasn't interested in sharing it and telling it to people. And so when press and reporters would come around, this other Maurice, would basically do the interviews. And in a lot of the coverage you can find in documentaries and various news coverage going back some years, this guy is kind of like the main advocate keeping the story alive. And it's important to note that Maurice Masse died 20 years ago, so he's no longer with us. His grandchildren still are, however. And this guy also runs this kind of local heritage association, where he's got this mural that's painted of the incident and newspaper articles from the time. And he's put on various kind of festivals and events. In 2015, he put on a major kind of a UFO conference in Valensole to celebrate the case. And they hold these expositions in town. There's one right now. So if you happen to live in Valensole or visiting Southern France through the entire month of July, you can go and visit this Valensole case exposition that they've got going on there. I don't know if they do it every year. I don't know about last year. I know they did it in 2022. But they do these events to kind of keep the story alive and going. And in fact, they kind of erected a historical landmark kind of out at or near the site. I don't actually believe it's located on the exact coordinates. I think it's kind of like across like the road. And this appears to be a temporary marker that they initially built perhaps at one of the earlier expositions because it looks a bit cheaper and a bit less structurally sound than what is there now if you use Google satellite and kind of like shared Google photos to look at it now. The craft looks to be a bit more structurally sound and permanent. And instead of these little green guys, they've got an actual kind of like a farmer moss figure, and they've got like a little guy kind of like next to the craft. But this is a temporary marker, and people still come out to visit it. You know, like I say, this is like Europe's supposedly best close encounter case. And so people that are out there in France like to visit this location, and they can visit this landmark that you can find on Google Maps. It's called under a waymark called Valensole's ET. And in fact, a year or two ago, this guy, Dominique Fidel, again, sorry about the name, would produce this documentary or drama. I believe it's a split. I have not seen it. I would love to see it one day with subtitles. But there's obviously at least a bit of an element of dramatization. I think it's kind of like a docudrama where they had actors kind of recreate the scenes. It looks kind of interesting. And they talked to his grandson and whatnot. One of the things that kind of stands out to me about this case is that I'm almost a little surprised that it's considered kind of the top close encounter, because it's really not unique, like not even remotely. Like, in fact, there does not really seem to be anything really impressive or unique about this case at all. If people are aware, France and Italy had a big wave of sightings in October 1954. Some of the more famous one was the Maurice Masse sighting in Quadruple, France. But there was many sightings, and all you have to do is look at Jacques Vallée's book, Passport to Magonia, turn to the middle of October 1954, and you can read dozens of cases almost identical to Maurice Masse's sighting, involving these small 4 feet or so tall dwarf creatures, involving paralyzation rays or beams or devices that paralyze either the person or a dog or something. And then these crafts tend to take off or hover, be briefly visible above the ground for a while before disappearing in advanced speed. And so there's kind of this long history of these short dwarf-like entity encounter cases with paralyzing rays in the French countryside. In fact, in many locations where Masse lived, and were reported in the same newspapers, regional and local newspapers that published his story. So it stretches the imagination to believe that he was not fully aware of many of these other stories that were going around in the town that he lived in. But it's up to you, I guess, to decide whether you thought he got some of the elements from his story. I think it's possible there's definitely some cultural contamination or contamination from other events that kind of potentially seeped in to the story. And kind of one other thing I just noted that stuck out to me when I stumbled across these illustrations. This is from the first French edition of translation of H.G. Wells' book, The War of the Worlds, illustrated by Henrique Avim Correa. And in one of these illustrations here, you can almost see it where it kind of almost looks like it's rugby ball shaped, and it's got this center kind of like drill pivot behind it, and it's on legs. On the photo on the other side, it doesn't really so much look like an elliptical object or rugby shaped ball, but again, you see these kind of central pivots, and they're standing on, four legs, and the one's shooting a ray gun. So there's clearly a lot of potential, both contamination from science fiction and just a long history of UFO cases of this type in the very region and areas of France, that Masse would be familiar with. With that, I will leave you basically with something that Masse relayed to Valais when he was there in May 1979 in regards to his sighting and what he thought about it. And again, McHale would also, Amy McHale would earlier in August 1967 say that Mr. Masse is a man that there dwells a certainty, a man who no longer displays any curiosity as to what the folk who have studied the question at great length, like Charles Bowen and myself, might say to him. So he says, Masse basically knows what he saw. He doesn't need convincing, and he doesn't need to convince anyone else. And unlike us ufologists who have not experienced it and have been looking for answers, he's already got the answers. And he says this to Jacques Vallée. To observe something like this was, quote, the very best thing I could wish on anyone, but added that a witness should not say anything, not even to his wife and children. One always says too much. So he leaves us in this case with this, a bit of mystification where, we don't know all the details. It's potentially likely we'll never know all the details. Supposedly he may have shared some of these secrets of his with some researchers. There's a lady investigator who says she plans to publish further information in a book, but it's only coming out after she is dead. So it's going to be a posthumously published book of hers. So not only is Masse dead for 20 years now, we have to wait for this lady to die before we get to hear what he supposedly may have said at some point way back when. Honestly, I don't see all the point for that mystification and, keeping these secrets, but Masse felt that you shouldn't tell these encounters to anyone, apparently. And so we have, again, like many of the cases I've covered, a fascinating and highly strange case, but again, with only one witness. We are left thinking perhaps it was a helicopter, perhaps it was a traumatic incident. Maybe it was another explanation was the waking dream that we've seen given for many of the cases that I've covered, the Emilson case, the Joe Simonton pancake case. And to me, that does seem actually quite plausible. We have all this missing time between when he showed up to tell his story and when this incident took place. And perhaps that's because when he was out there smoking a cigarette, he actually just fell asleep. And in a state of kind of a lucid dream, one of these helicopters landed in his field and he distorted the facts, and it became, this crazy story that when he woke up that he went and told people. Who knows? That's, I guess, will be up to you to decide. Or maybe he was visited by these creatures from elsewhere. I guess we'll never know. Again, like all these stories, the main witnesses are dead. There's nowhere we can really else go with the evidence, I think, at this point. And it'll be up to other people to decide what they want to deal with this case. But honestly, while it's a fun and very interesting case, and there's a lot of material on it, I don't see why it's been put up as like the best case, because it's not even particularly unique. I think there's probably far better cases in Europe to be addressed. Well, thank you guys very much.